Timing is everything, right? Timing is really important. Timing is really important. Okay, so Friday, my kids had their last day of school. And we took them to a park. They're having this big party for the school at the park. There were hundreds of people there, so there was no parking. And so I dropped my girls off right by the playground, and I drove over and I parked, and now I'm walking back. And this is in Golden at Lions Park, if you've ever been there. And so there's like this walkway by the river, if you know what I'm talking about. And out of the corner of my eye while I'm walking back, I look over, and there's this guy on the other side of the street, like 20, 30 yards away. And he's not even looking at me. I can't even see his face. But I see like his body type and how he's walking, and my brain goes, that's Matt Terrell. Now, here's the thing. This is an old college friend of mine that I had in mind. Like, I haven't seen him for years, and he lives in Boston, Massachusetts. Nowhere near us, right? So the sane part of my brain went, you can't even see the guy's face. You're crazy. Don't say anything. But we all got a little crazy in us, right? And so I'm like, no, this could actually be Matt. I haven't seen him for years. I could be passing up an opportunity to see him. And you should definitely, the little crazy voice goes, you should definitely scream the name Matt really loud and just see if he turns around. And you can guess what I did. So I'm like, Matt! And he turns around, and it's my old friend Matt from college. Haven't seen the guy in years, lives in Boston, right? Lives in Boston. And his wife, Lene, who is an old friend of my wife's, like, they're right there across the street. And you can see him be like, who is yelling my name in Colorado? What in the world? I don't know, but what in the world is going on? And then he registers, it's Darvin, which took him a little bit because I lost some hair a couple weeks ago. So, right? So he figures out who's yelling his name, and he comes over, and we get to catch up for like 30, 40 minutes. We got to talk to these old, really good friends of ours from way back in the day. Now, at the end, I'm walking back to the car, and they went on this hike, and wouldn't you know it, it's again the perfect second. As I walk back to my car, they're done with their hike, and we get to walk back to the cars together. And so we're laughing about the timing of that. Like, what is the timing, right? I mean, think about this. This is crazy. What is the timing? He doesn't live anywhere near her. He could have come to Colorado any other week of the year. He could have gone on that hike any other day of the week. They could have been going down that sidewalk any other second. Had it been any other little 10-second gap, I wouldn't have seen him. And I had to be crazy enough to yell the name Matt in a crowd when it probably wasn't him, right? So you put all that together, and the timing is just crazy. The timing is crazy. And I bet you have had some of these experiences in life too. Like, timing is everything. Timing is so important. And because it's so important, we get really caught up in the timing of things, don't we? We get really caught up in when things happen and when they're going to happen, right? We don't like when we have to wait for things too long, or maybe something happened and we weren't ready for it yet. It happened too early. Like, the timing of things is really important. So what we do is we try to control the timing. Now, God has timing. Those of us who are people of faith, we know that God has a timing for things in our life. And yet, because we know that timing is everything and timing is so important, we try to control the timing. We try to control the timing. And what happens is this. What I have found is that God doesn't seem to be accepting my Google Calendar invite, right, to the events in my life, okay? He's not getting on board with my timeline. In fact, it seems like he has his own timeline that he's working on, and he's not sharing it with me, right? And so what happens when we're discontent and frustrated with God's timing is a lot of us will force or we'll press, right? We force the issue, and we maybe should have been waiting. We hear from the Spirit we should be waiting. It's not happening yet, and yet we're not trusting God's timing, and so what do? We make something happen before it should have, and that's a mess if you've ever done that. Or sometimes we get really frustrated and we get apathetic, and we actually give up on God doing that thing in our life. We actually give up because we just can't trust the timing. Or sometimes it comes early, or something's happening in the time we didn't like, and so we actually miss the opportunity, all because we didn't trust the timing of God. I know I've gone through this multiple times in my life. We struggle to trust the timing of God. It is tough to trust God's timing. And so this morning, we're reading this story in the book of Esther. And what I want to talk about is three different things that we need to know if we're going to learn how to trust the timing of God. 3 different tasks that we want to undertake if we are going to trust the timing of God. But first, I want to get you caught up on the story. In case you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, is where we are in this book of Esther. I actually love this book. It's an incredible book of the Bible, okay? So it's the 400s BC. And God's people, the Israelites, they're exiled, they're dispersed around the Persian Empire at this point, okay? Around this empire. And the powerful Persian Empire is run by a guy named Xerxes, King Xerxes. Now in chapter 1, when we meet Xerxes, he's all upset because his wife, the queen, won't come down to his party when he invites her, so he kicks her out as queen. And so he throws a beauty contest to decide who's going to be queen next, because apparently that's what you do. I don't know, but he does it. He throws this contest, and Esther wins it. Now, Esther is secretly Jewish. She's secretly one of God's people. And Esther was raised by her cousin turned father figure, Mordecai. So she becomes queen, and Mordecai, well, he is in this capital city of Susa, where Xerxes is and where Esther's queen. And one day, the second most powerful person in all the Persian Empire, the true villain, the evil person in our story named Haman, he goes riding through the streets because like a modern-day celebrity, he really needed the praise of others, right? So he gets on this cool horse, he's riding through the streets, and he wants everyone to praise him. Mordecai's like, no, absolutely not. I only praise God. I'm only bowing down to God, not you. And so Haman he's just furious about this, that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And so Haman, who hates the Jews anyway, because Haman's people were ancient enemies of the Jews, he hatches a plan. He finds Xerxes in a moment when Xerxes is a little drunk, which isn't hard to do apparently, and he lies to him about the Jewish people disobeying Xerxes. And he gets them, he tricks them, he manipulates them into putting out this decree that can't be taken back in the kingdom, that all the Jewish people are going to be annihilated in just a few months. There's a date that they've circled on the calendar. On this date, all the Jewish people will be killed. Well, Mordecai gets wind of this, and he gets a hold of Esther and is like, only you have the power, only you have the position to turn this around, to save us. Only you have the king's ear in a way that maybe he could hear. Maybe if you went to him, maybe he would turn around, he would fix this situation and save our people. Maybe you've come to your position for such a time as this. But the problem is that even though that Esther is the only one that has the power and position to fix this thing, she has not been invited into the king's presence in 30 days. She doesn't know where she stands with the king. And there's this rule that if you go into the throne room, if you go talk to the king without being invited, if he doesn't forgive you, if he doesn't lower his scepter down and forgive you for your intrusion, you will be put to death, even if you're queen. And so Esther knows. Esther knows she's the only one that could possibly save the Jewish people, and yet she also knows that she could die. She's risking everything. She's risking her life the minute she walks into this throne room. And now as we come to chapter 5, this is the moment we get to find out what's going to happen when she walks into this throne room to talk to Xerxes, to beg for her people's life. So chapter 5 starts like this. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. That was the symbol. That was the symbol that Xerxes was forgiving her for the intrusion of being in his presence. It was the symbol that she would have the distinct honor of keeping her head firmly attached to her shoulders. Verse 3, then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you if it pleases the king, replied Esther. Let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I've prepared for them. Now, notice something here. Esther's people are about to be put to death. Like, this is a pressing and urgent need, right? But she waits to tell the king. Isn't that curious? I mean, if it was you or I, we'd like run into the throne and be like, we're all gonna die. You gotta save us. But that's not what she does. There's this pressing and urgent need, and yet she waits. She waits. She waits. We wouldn't because we're impatient. We like to press God's timing. We hate to wait. But I think as you read the story, it's kind of clear that Esther is receiving messages from the Holy Spirit working on her for the timing. So Esther doesn't press God's timing. She waits well because God is guiding her. She waits for his perfect timing to come. Verse 5, so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given to you. Okay, so now the king, Haman, Esther, they're all in the same place at the same time. This is the perfect moment, right? This is a perfect moment for her to come on, say it, Esther. Get his help. Tell Xerxes that Haman tricked him. Tell Xerxes your people and you are going to be annihilated. Isn't this the perfect moment? Isn't it the perfect timing? Verse 7, Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I'll answer the king's question. Wait a second, Esther, you got everybody in the room at one time. Isn't this the perfect timing? Isn't this the perfect moment to say, all right, King Xerxes, this dude, Haman, here's what he's doing to you. Here's what he's doing to me. He tricked you and he's going to kill. Isn't this the perfect timing? Well, it's not, because it isn't God's timing. Again, I believe the Holy Spirit is working on her to tell her, hey, it's not right yet. The time isn't right yet. It's not God's time. You got to trust God's timing. Again, if it was one of us, we'd blurt out in this moment, come on, you got to help us. This would be our time. But Esther doesn't. She doesn't press God's timing when it's not right. And we're going to find out why. Verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Verse 14, his wife, that means Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So, Haman, he leaves this banquet that Esther had set up, right? Without Esther even revealing she's Jewish, revealing anything about Haman's plan to Xerxes. Haman leaves the banquet. He's walking down the roads. He's had a little much, right? And he's all excited. And then he sees his old enemy Mordecai, who we just found out a few chapters ago. Haman hates this guy, wouldn't bow down to him. He remembers, I hate this guy named Mordecai. So he goes home and he figures, I'm going to build this big pole to execute Mordecai by impaling him. And if you like impalements, which it would be a weird thing, but you would really like this book. There's a lot of it in this book. You're going to be a big fan. So now Esther's asking the king. It just became more urgent, right? I mean, the timing became even more important because she can't wait months. She can't wait weeks until this decree is going to take place and all the Jewish people are going to be annihilated. No, that next morning, Mordecai, her cousin, Mordecai, the guy who raised her as his own daughter, that Mordecai is going to be impaled on this pole. The timing's really important. It's really urgent. But she waits, and she waits well. It's tough to trust the timing of God. But like Esther, if we're going to undertake the task of waiting well, if we're going to undertake this task of trusting the timing of God, we have to wait well. And Esther did that. Now, by waiting well, what I mean is she didn't do what I often do. That when God has me waiting, what do? We press it. We force it. We're like, oh, it hasn't happened yet. I'll find a way. I'll make it happen right now. Even though maybe God's put it on my heart to wait, I'm just going to make this thing go, right? Because it's on my calendar for today, God, so we're doing this thing, right? Isn't that what we do sometimes? Or sometimes we give up. We think, apparently it's never going to happen. Okay, God, it's not going to happen on my timeline. I guess So we get apathetic and we give up. She doesn't do that either. She doesn't do it. So she waits well to ask Xerxes for help in this throne room. Again and again. She waits and doesn't say it in the throne room. She waits at the first banquet, doesn't say it. She waits, doesn't say it after when this pole is being built for Mordecai's death. She waits well. But usually we don't. I know often in my life I haven't waited well on the Lord. And the problem is we don't quite trust his timing. And so we do. We get discontent and we get frustrated and we press things and we force things or we get apathetic to things because we wanted our agenda. All these things are destructive forms of waiting. And I bet we've all done some of these things, right? When we're waiting on the Lord, we do this. And what I have found as I've done that through the years is this. Waiting looks a lot more clear in the rearview mirror, doesn't it? Doesn't waiting look a lot more clear in the rearview mirror? And by that I mean that often when you're waiting on something for the Lord, it only makes sense when it's in the past. Haven't you gone through those situations? You were waiting on God, and in it, you're like, I do not get this, God. And then on the other side of you, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I understand why you had me wait. Waiting looks a lot more clear in the rearview mirror. I bet you have stories in the past where you're frustrated with God's timing. You don't get why he has you waiting. But now that it's in the rearview mirror of life, you could see that it was God's hand working for you, not against you, getting you ready, not keeping you in place. So the next time you're waiting and you're struggling to trust God's timing, you got to tell yourself the stories of how God has used that waiting for your good in the past. If we want to trust the timing of God, we must undertake the task of waiting well. So now Esther has waited a couple times, right? She's waited a couple times to be able to tell the king, to ask for the king's help. And now the timing, this is good. It's just incredible. Chapter 6, verse 1. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. We actually saw this earlier in the book, right? Mordecai had found out that these two guards were going to kill the king, and he had rooted it out. But guess what? The king didn't ever find out. Okay, so now on this night, the same night where Haman's going to ask the permission of Xerxes to execute Mordecai, that same night, the king can't sleep. He's got some insomnia, right? And he cannot find the Ambien anywhere, okay? So he's like, hey, give me this Chronicles book, right? And what it is it's a little bit like what today, maybe you would have the presidential briefings, all the stuff that's happening in the kingdom, like the most important things. It's the book that if he were a good king, he should be reading it every day to keep himself, up to date. But he most certainly is not a good king, so he hasn't read the thing. And so he doesn't know that Mordecai just saved his life. And so in God's timing, he can't sleep. That's not an accident, right? And he calls for this book, and he opens it, and he finds out that Mordecai saved his life. And so, verse 3, he says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Well, nothing's been done for him, his attendants answered. So the king asks, okay, who's at court? Meaning, which one of my officials, my dudes, could come and help me figure out how to honor this Mordecai? And the only person in court is Haman, because he's there to ask the king to let him murder Mordecai, right? Which, again, timing. So the king calls out for Haman, and he comes in. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered to the king, For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor, right? Or at least that's how I think he would have said it. He's not happy about this. Afterward, Mordecai returned to this king's gates, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. God's timing is impeccable. It's impeccable. In the very second that Haman has come to the court to ask Xerxes' permission to impale Mordecai on a pole, Xerxes is finding out that Mordecai saved his life and calls Haman in because he's there to ask permission to murder Mordecai on a pole. He calls him in, and he's like, how do I honor somebody who's really served me well? And Haman's so narcissistic, he's like, well, if you really want to know what I want for my birthday, and so he goes on and on about what he wants. Oh, no. The king's like, okay, cool, go do all of that for Mordecai. And you could be like, Haman's like, what? No, I should be me. And so now he has to go honor, which is especially ironic because earlier in the book, the whole thing that created all of this was that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman when he was riding through the streets on a horse asking to be praised. And now who's on the horse? It's Mordecai. The timing is just crazy. So now Haman's mad. He's hot. He's as hot as if like a Carolina Reaper and a ghost pepper had a baby, right? He is just steaming hot. He is mad. Now, pause the story for a second and think about God's timing here. This is chapter 6, and if you study this book, all the scholars will tell you, chapter 6 is where the whole story changes. It's the hinge in the story. Everything pivots off this moment in chapter 6. Here in chapter 6, you see God's perfect timing unfold. Because Mordecai, who was unknown, not just that he wasn't loved and liked by the king had no idea who the dude was before this moment. So he was unknown to the king before this, but in this chapter and in this moment, what begins to happen is he begins to eclipse Haman in power and persuasion and influence with the king. So think about God's timing now that you know a little more of the story. Think about the timing of how God had Esther wait to tell the king. Because Esther, if she would have not waited, if she would have pressed her timing over God's timing, she would have been asking for the king to go against Haman and for Mordecai and the Jews when the king still thought Haman was awesome and had no idea who Mordecai was. Do you get it? So had Esther not trusted the timing of God, the king would have rejected her request out of hand. She would have died. Mordecai would have been impaled the next morning on a pole, and all of her people would have been annihilated, simply because she pressed it, simply because she didn't wait, simply because she didn't trust God's timing, and she blurted it out when the Holy Spirit said not to. That's what would happen. But instead, she trusts God's timing, and she waits, and God brings about an event that changes everything about how the king sees the Jews and sees Mordecai. And now, they're all going to be saved. Now, don't you think that like us, Esther wanted to burst into that throne room and say it the very first time? Don't you think she didn't want to wait? I know I wouldn't have wanted. Well, don't you think she didn't have a plan in her own head? But she trusted God. She trusted God. She realized, you know what? Maybe God's right and I am wrong. Don't we struggle to admit that to ourselves sometimes? We're like, this already happened, right? God, what are you doing? We're saying, I'm right, God. Your timing's wrong. And maybe I'm a little smarter than you, right? But she knows that God is smarter. God is smarter than we are. It's easy to forget that my timing is wrong. God's timing is right because God is smarter than me. Just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. When I was a senior in high school, I had to have this big back surgery, right? And my whole life was sports. And so I have this back surgery, and the back's never easy, never painless, and it was at like the perfectly wrong moment in my senior year. And I was hoping to go to college on a scholarship and, you know, all this stuff. At that point, it was for wrestling, and like that was my hope, right? And I remember laying on my sofa a couple days after the surgery and realizing, like, this isn't going to happen now. Like, God, why was the timing now? I've had this injury for like 3 years. God, why couldn't this timing of the surgery been a year ago where I wouldn't have lost any opportunity I had to keep playing? And I remember being really frustrated. Like, it was not the timing that I would have chosen. It was knocked me out of any chances like going on and doing what I wanted to do, what I had planned. The timing was perfectly wrong according to my plan, right? But God's smarter than me. And now that waiting period, that thing that wasn't in my timing is in the rearview mirror, I know that instead of going somewhere to play at a different college, I went 40 minutes down the road to the college near me, and you know what? That's where I really came to know Christ for myself. That's where I met my wife, Megan. That was a little more emotional than I thought I was going to get. So had I known that, obviously I wouldn't have been frustrated with God's timing, but in the moment when you're struggling to trust God's timing, you don't know what's going to come. But you have to trust that God knows better than you. I know I didn't then, but it makes sense now. You have to trust the timing of God. You have to be able to go, even though I want this now, I'm wrong, you're right, you're smarter than me. If we want to trust the timing of God, we must undertake the task of remembering God is smarter than I am. So now after she's waited, she waited in the throne room, she waited at the first banquet, she waited when Haman went out on the road. Oh, now timing's going to be just right. Chapter 7. Verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. This is the second banquet, right? And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted. Now, before Esther answers this, you got to remember, in God's timing, nobody knows she's Jewish. In God's timing, nobody knows she's related to Mordecai, but now the timing is right. Verse 3, then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. The timing is right. She says it, right? She's asking for Xerxes' help. She's saying what's going on. She says, my people are about to be killed. Verse 5, King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. Now, if you remember back to when we saw in an earlier chapter 3, we saw Xerxes get tricked kind of, right, by Haman. Haman came to Xerxes and he's like, hey, you know, these Jewish people, they're not obeying you. They don't like you. Oh, and I'll give you $200 million if you pass this law to annihilate them all. And we were wondering in the moment, I wonder if Xerxes really knows what's going on. He seems kind of drunk right now, and he's being lied to. Well, it seems now that he didn't really understand what was going on, which is complete incompetence, right? But we find out, yeah, he's like, wait, what happened? I signed this thing? I don't remember signing this thing. Who did this? Who tricked me? Who did this? Who manipulated me into signing this decree to kill all your people? So now Xerxes is in a rage, right? He's getting really upset. Verse 6, Esther said, an adversary and an enemy "This vile Haman." Dude's sitting right there. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Timing is everything. Timing is everything. I mean, get this, right? So she waits. She finally tells the king, when the timing's just right, what Haman had tricked him into doing. And now the King Xerxes, because he has the emotional maturity of my toddler, King Xerxes, he runs out into the garden. And while he's out there, Haman's like, "I know that dude. He's going to kill me the minute he comes back." Right? And so he knows his only hope is to go try to beg Esther. And so you can see, Haman is like so upset. You can see him crying, and he's kind of like stumbling. And then Esther's on this big sofa because she's royalty. So other people bring you this stuff. I'm trying to get my kids to bring me this stuff. They don't bring you anything, right? And so I have to get off the sofa. But she doesn't because she's queen. And so, she's queen, and she's laying back. And he's like, "Oh, please." And he falls right on the sofa, right on her. And the timing's just wrong when Xerxes comes back in the room, and he takes that as him trying to physically attack his wife. And he's like, "Oh, yeah, you're done. You are done." Verse 8, as soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Perfectly wrong timing for Haman, right? For Xerxes to burst back in the room. Why do they cover his face? Because when people lie and you catch them lying, don't listen to them anymore. It's something we forget. Verse 9, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands in Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. I told you, if you're a big fan of impalement, great book for you, right? Just earlier, this same day, Haman had this massive pole put up. Why that high? So that it could see Mordecai. He wanted to see everybody see Mordecai be executed. Now that same pole he built for Mordecai, he himself is executed on. Bad timing for Haman, right? And I'm glad we've gotten to know Haman, because if we didn't, it'd be sad. But actually, it's just kind of funny at this point. But if you wait a second, if you notice something, trusting God's timing is about waiting. Often it's about waiting, right? And we talk about that. Church says, okay, great. But then, trusting God's timing is about grasping the moment when it comes, right? It's about taking the swing when the opportunity arises. Yeah, wait when God says wait, but when God says act, act. Both are trusting God's timing. So when I was a kid, I played way too much baseball. And there was this pitch in baseball called the changeup. And it was all to mess with your timing as a batter. So you'd be, there's a batter, and the ball becomes, about the same speed, and then they throw a changeup, and it'd be much slower to mess with your timing. Now, usually the way you mess up a changeup is that you swing too early, because you're used to it coming earlier than it is, right? So you swing before you should. Now, that's a good picture of a lot of times what we do when we press God's timing. We swing too early. We take the swing before the ball's there. We take the swing before God brought it up. When we were supposed to be still waiting, we pressed it, right? But here's the thing. There's one worse mistake than swinging early, and that's not taking the swing at all, right? So in baseball, you get that changeup. Sure, it's bad to swing early, but you got to swing. You got to swing. When the ball arrives, when it's there, you got to swing. Churches talk a lot about waiting. We should. Waiting is so hard. I hate to wait. But when God puts an opportunity in front of you, that's the time to act. That's the time to take the swing. Too many Christians watch God give them an opportunity to share faith, to be generous, to take a risk for faith, to achieve a dream, to do something God put in front of them, and they never take the swing. We don't take it. When the timing is just right, Esther did not sit back. She was not passive. She overcame the fear, right? What is Haman going to do? Will the king believe me? She overcame all of that. And when the opportunity was right, when it was right there, she took it. She took the swing. Being passive when God calls you to be active is not patience and it is not faithfulness. It is a lack of a trust in God. We have to be a people who take a big swing for God when he puts it in front of us. So to learn to trust God's timing, we got to take the swing. We got to take the swing. So this is Esther's story of trusting God's timing. Don't worry, we have more of this story in weeks to come. It only gets better from here. It's awesome. And you're like, how does it get better than seeing Haman impaled on his own pole? It will get better, okay? It's an incredible story. It's this incredible story. But here we get to see Esther trust God's timing. Not just once. She trusts it in the throne room. She trusts it in this banquet. She trusts it on the streets. And then she trusts his timing in the second banquet when she actually takes the swing and tells Xerxes. We get to see Esther wait well. We get to see Esther remember that God is smarter than her. We get to see Esther take the swing and save all her people. It is tough to trust the timing of God. We have a schedule God does not seem to be on. We try to press when God is trying our patience. We try to control everything while God isn't even sharing the timeline. God's timing is rarely our timing, isn't it? And we've got to trust the timing of God. We've got to trust the timing of God. I got to admit, I have struggled with this in my life. There was one time in particular that I'll tell you about. It was years ago, about 2012. In 2012, I graduated from seminary. So I'd been in youth ministry, had done some other jobs, and then, I went to seminary. I was like, I want to be like a lead pastor or associate. I want to do this. I want to, after seminary. But if you remember, 2012, terrible time to get a job, right? It was at the end of the recession. And so churches just didn't have positions, and I just couldn't find a position anywhere. So I was doing volunteer stuff, but, I had to make money somehow. And so I went back into construction, right? And so I was I was doing odd jobs, but then I was also doing these corporate retail installs. And by that, I mean I would go into a Weight Watchers and I would build it, like the inside, like all the cabinetry and all that stuff. And so what we would do is we would travel around the Midwest and we would, for 3 days, we'd work 16 to 20 hours getting this thing installed. We had all these deadlines. It was a crazy job. And so you drive somewhere different to some small town that you'd never been to and you certainly never wanted to come back to. And you would do this for 3 days. You'd do these installs. And I just remember being like, why in the world am I here, God? Like I did, overseas stuff. I was a youth pastor. I went to seminary because I thought you wanted me to do this, this, and this. And now I'm installing a TV in a Weight Watchers in Tulsa? Like, what is happening, I remember distinctly one time, it was another time in Oklahoma, it's like 1 or 2 a.m., and I'm working on this big cabinet on the floor, and I just pause, and I look out the dark window, and I wasn't even mad at that point, I was just sad. I was just like, God, I don't get it. This isn't my plan. This isn't my timing. I went to all this school and stuff. What happened? Why am I here? Why this timing? Why don't I have this thing that I wanted, that I thought you wanted? Why don't I have it right now? And it was so hard for me. And it was really, really hard to trust the timing of God. But now I look back at that experience in the rearview mirror, and man, it makes so much sense to me. It was so hard in the moment, because I had a different plan, but now I'm like, oh man, that makes a ton of sense to me. In so many ways. In one way, it's just like killing my ego, Unfortunately, I've gotten to be in different churches and seen pastors who the ego just blew up a church or blew stuff up, and I'll tell you what, there's something about hanging up your 4th Jennifer Hudson poster in the middle of nowhere at like 2 a.m. one night that will take care of any ego that you've got left, okay? It will humble you very, very quickly. And it humbled me. It really humbled me. And I needed that. It humbled me. So thank God I had that experience, right? And also, it grew me in my perseverance. That discontentment actually worked on my heart to go, man, I have a hunger to be in ministry. Man, I have a hunger to do this thing for God. if I ever get a chance to do that again, I'm never going to give it up. That's what God's got for me. And so during the pandemic, for example, man, some of my friends that were in ministry and stuff bowed out. But partly because of that experience, years ago, when I was struggling to even trust the timing of God, that him making me wait and giving me this hunger to do what I do, better believe I wasn't going to give up. And a lot of that was tied back to this time where God was making me wait and making me trust him. Even when I was like, I don't like this God. Even when daily I was like, I don't like this God. Or even little things like, when you're in construction, you grow in your skills in construction. And so I grew in, not Stephen Trampy levels, right? Not that, but I got better. And I've even used some of that in the last months as we've moved into this building, right? God's consistently somehow used construction skills. All the different stuff. So God took this moment, and it was a couple years in my life. One particular year, but kind of 2 years. And he took this moment where I didn't wait that well, right? He took this moment where I had to trust his timing with varying degrees of success. And he used it later. And so now looking back in the rearview mirror, I get it. I get God's timing. I can see he really is smarter than me. I can see his timing was right, mine was wrong. I can see all the ways in which he used that wait. And that's my hope and prayer for you, is that you'd learn to trust God's timing. Trust his timing. That you'd wait well when he has you wait. That you wouldn't grow discontent and frustrated and try to press something. That you would really wait well. And that you would remind yourself when you've got a plan and you don't see it happening on your timeline, that maybe he's right and you're wrong. That he really is smarter. And then, that you wouldn't miss the opportunity when it came. That after you wait and God brings that opportunity, you would take the swing. Let us learn. Let us learn to trust the timing of God.